Good evening. It's wonderful to have such a large crowd here this evening for our university lecture. As you know, the university lecture dates to 1950. It was conceived as a way to honor Boston University's most distinguished scholars and researchers and to bring their work to the attention of the university community and to the broader public. This is a great tradition which we continue tonight. If you scan the list of the earliest lectures, you'll note that then, as now, lecturers were drawn from across the university and from all domains: humanities, biology, international relations, and medicine. From the titles of their lectures, you'll see this breadth and the continual focus of our faculty on seeking answers to some of the great questions facing society. Refugee migration is one of these questions. Conflict and oppression produces refugees. In our time, there is an ample supply of both, and an ample supply of oppression as well. Consequently, an ample supply of people desperately seeking refuge. So the topic of Mohammed Zaman's lecture tonight, the quest for ethical solutions for the global refugee crisis, is very appropriate for the time. Mohammed Zaman is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor of Biomedical Engineering in the College of Engineering. His primary academic field is chemistry. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. But he is also extensively educated in physics and mathematics, close to my heart. Many in this room know of his work to develop a compact and reliable device to test the purity of pharmaceutical products, particularly those sold or distributed in underdeveloped countries and regions where dangerous counterfeit drugs are common. This particular strand of his work is emblematic of his deep commitment to improve the human condition. As he worked to develop technologies that can solve pressing problems, he has necessarily learned much about health policy and systems, especially in regions where resources are few and the needs are great. I commend to you the description of Muhammad's life and career that we asked him to prepare as part of the program for tonight. You will see that his path to his current position was circuitous but instructive. He grew up in Pakistan, the child of teachers in modest circumstances. He lost his father early. His experience of his father's death due to cancer and his witnessing the experiences of his mother and sisters, among other things, helped shape his work and fire his drive to excel and to develop the means to improve the human condition. During his youth, Pakistan became the home to 2 million Afghan refugees. Currently, the work in his research group at Boston University focuses on understanding and decoupling the chemical, biological, and mechanical basis of tumor invasion that precedes metastasis. He and his team are on a quest to stop cancer. Another quest, every bit as challenging, is to find an ethical solution to the global refugee crisis. This is his topic for tonight, and we look forward to hearing from him. Professor Zaman.
Thank you so much, President Brown. Thank you so much for coming, all of you. Many of you have come from across the road, but there are people who have come from great distances. I want to sort of particularly note my postdoc advisor, who's based in Singapore, and changed his travel plan so that he could be here. So it means a lot to me. I know there are some people here who travel from Washington, D.C. and New York as well, so I really appreciate it. I want to start the lecture today by telling a story that started about 40 years ago in December of 1979. This was the front page of New York Times on 27 December 1979. And I want to draw your attention to the story on top right. Something was brewing in Afghanistan, and there was a lot of suspicion for that. The next day, change happened. The government in Afghanistan was toppled. The former Soviet invasion started. And with that came refugees through the eastern border to Pakistan, about 2.5 million of them. Now, these refugees lived in very, very difficult conditions. And I want to show just a 1-minute video to give you a sense, and the video is from that time, of the conditions these people lived in. Unfortunately, their condition hasn't changed even to this day. Just for a minute, let's look at this video.
The war in Afghanistan has brought increased global attention to the ongoing Afghan refugee crisis. This crisis represents one of the largest refugee populations in the world. According to UN sources, more than 5 million Afghan refugees require basic necessities and medical care for their continued survival. This crisis continues to grow rapidly as Afghanis flee the continued fighting in their homeland and seek shelter in Pakistan, Iran, and other neighboring countries. Of these 5 million refugees, approximately 2 million are women and 2.5 million are children. In Pakistan alone, as many as 1 million Afghan refugee children are orphans. Throughout the cities and truck stops of Pakistan, these children can be seen eating out of the garbage in order to survive.
Many of these refugees did not stay at the border and came to the cities, including the one where I was growing up in Islamabad. The presence of these foreigners fueled racism and xenophobia. It's not to say that Pakistan didn't have its own challenges, but over the years, these challenges started getting blamed on Afghan refugees, from petty crime to terrorism, from lawlessness to joblessness. It was always the foreigner. Show of hands if that rhetoric sounds familiar. And you know, the reason I show this video and this picture is twofold. First is to demonstrate that poor policy and lack of good approaches can cause these crises to be protracted. The refugee challenge in Pakistan still remains 40 years later. And the second issue is that for many of us, growing in many different parts of the world, the problem was in our own backyards. And it has stayed like that for many, many years. So today I want to talk to you about 4 different things, and they're all sort of connected. First thing is I want to talk about the size and the magnitude of the problem of global refugees. Then I want to talk about why our science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are often absent from the conversation when it comes to addressing the global refugee crisis. Then I'll talk about some of our own work in this area and what we have learned over the years. And finally, hopefully a conversation starter on how do you build a coalition at a university like Boston University that is inherently global and really touches the lives of so many people around the world. As a science and engineering person, we're all about numbers, and stats do matter to us. So I want to start with some basic stats here. The UN High Commission for Refugee estimates that today there are about 70.8 million refugees in the world. People who are displaced out of their homes by force, by conflict, or because of other strife. What is remarkable and perhaps troubling is that this number is 2.5 million people more today than this was at this time last year. On average, it takes 2 seconds for a person to lose the home. It took me longer to read that sentence. The impact on individual countries and communities is also quite substantial. Syria, a country that is ancient and has been a land of culture and tradition, has lost half of its population of 13 million people in the last 5 years. But you know, stats often do not do justice to the complexity. One of the things that is important as we look at the refugee crisis is the countries that host them. Most of them are countries that are in the low and middle income category. These countries are not particularly affluent, have their own development challenges. And that means that this really complicates the problem further. Pakistan is one of them. Of all the countries that you look here, the only one that is a high-income country is Germany. And that too has been in the last 5 years that the policies have changed. Just by comparison, Lebanon has a population of about 6 million and hosts about 1.5 million refugees. That's 25% of the population. On the other hand, the situation in the US has been on the decline in the last 30 years. In 1980, US had said they could take 230,000 refugees. That number has dwindled to 18,000 this year and is probably going to go down further. So it really makes us think of what the challenges are and how do you really engage globally. But then I want to ask the question, why has it been largely disciplines of economics, social sciences, humanities, public health, medicine, and less so in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? Certainly, there is a need in science and technology, engineering, and mathematics to do their part in training ethical leaders, global citizens, people who are able to tackle complex challenges of their time. And there are several reasons. It is commonly perceived that there are no real problems of science and engineering and mathematics that actually need to be addressed that concern with refugees. And I want to sort of dispel that notion. Of course, there are issues of infrastructure and hygiene and water, and those we know, but I want to sort of talk that there are things beyond that as well that are important. Of course, there is a necessity to design technologies that work at the point of care in these complex places. So design thinking, which is very core of engineering, is needed. And these technologies need to go beyond what we already have. They need to be able to work in these complex places. They need to work in ways that are going to give us the results to generate evidence and make better cure. Of course, issues of data, privacy are important, and certainly important questions need to be asked. How do you protect the data of people who are stateless and voiceless? What is needed? What kind of new technologies, new approaches are needed? Something that I'll talk about a little bit more is the issue of antimicrobial resistance. That is an important issue, whether you are at a refugee site in Colombia or you look at the problem at MGH. And the reason it is important is because refugees are often confined to small places. Hygiene is an important issue there. Access to quality medicines isn't quite what we would like it to be. Infection rates are high. So that really makes it for a deadly and a poisonous cocktail to create antimicrobial resistance. And there are important questions in science that need to be addressed in that context. Mental health is an issue, certainly on the minds of many. It's a major thrust in a research area, including on this campus. And there are issues of trauma, there are issues of resilience, there are issues of dealing with loss that affect our mental health, and there are important questions from both a science and engineering perspective that need to be asked in that context as well. The problem, because scientists and engineers historically have not engaged in refugee health, is that we continue to reinforce ideas that were designed 30, 40, 50 years ago, and we don't even know if they work or not. We don't know if they ever worked. And in the absence of those ideas, we continue to push the same thing over and over again. So somebody might ask, why is there a STEM bottleneck? Why is it that scientists and engineers, despite good intentions, are unable to or unwilling to engage? And there are three reasons for that. The first one is an obvious one, that they would argue that there's not enough funding in this area. And that argument is true, but it's a two-sided argument. 20 years ago, there was not a lot of funding in global health technologies. And the reason it became a more robust area is because people argued that we do need funding, that there are important questions that need to be addressed. So we need more scientists and engineers to argue, to lobby, to generate awareness, to be the advocates. And as the funding comes in, more people will come in, and so on and so forth. So that's the first issue. The second one is traditional areas of science, for very good reasons, have been siloed. The hypothesis-driven research in general requires things to be much more focused. But if we are really genuinely interested in complex problems of our time, in addressing the societal issues, we have to work across disciplinary boundaries, not just within academic disciplines, but also with colleagues who are on the ground and in the field. And perhaps one that is closest to my own heart is that we are not doing enough in the classrooms to generate awareness about these issues. Students who will be in the workforce tomorrow and the day after need to be educated of the complexities of these challenges so that when they go into their professional lives, they're able to be both the advocates to generate more funding and also are able to work across disciplinary boundaries to be able to address these questions. Before I talk about my own research, I want to first acknowledge the people who deserve the real credit. Typically, people acknowledge at the end, but I find that a little troubling because none of this work that I'm going to show would be possible without the graduate students, the postdocs, and the undergraduates, the research technicians. This is the list of graduate students in the last 10 years and postdocs that I've had. The ones who are colored are the ones who are currently in the lab. Over the last 10 years at BU, I've had 164 undergraduates working in my lab. And I've learned from every single one of them. There's another group of people that I want to recognize who have been instrumental in helping me do the things that I do and keeping me sort of both sane at times and compliant with the laws, and that is the staff. They make sure that things get done, from ordering things to making sure that the grants are submitted on time and they're managed in the best possible way. These people are absolutely essential in my success. And of course, I'm very, very honored to have colleagues in my department and beyond, department leadership, college leadership, and university leadership, as well as funding sources. So let's talk a little bit about research. I want you to imagine for a second yourself in a refugee environment. I hope nobody ever has to live in that place. And consider yourself in that place, and if you want to seek healthcare, let's say you want to seek medicines, what really drives your decision? That is not the proximity of the facility. It is not how fancy the facility is. Our work and some of the work of other colleagues in anthropology and sociology have said there's only one reason people seek certain kind of healthcare, go to certain vendors, choose certain drugs, and that is trust. They would go to a particular place and not another place because they're worried that the other place may report them. They may go to a street vendor and not the hospital because they don't trust the people at the hospital. And this happens over and over again. Unfortunately, in conflict and in places where refugees have faced tremendous xenophobia and racism, that trust starts to erode. This is a picture from a medicine depot in Syria, and you can imagine that there is no reason for anybody to have any trust, right? So our work in many ways is based at creating that trust in the system. There's also a criticism, and I think that's a valid criticism of humanitarian approaches, that they are very focused on transient issues, on here and now. On the other hand, refugees, as I mentioned in Pakistan, have been there for 40 years. Palestinian refugees have been there for 72. The Syrian ones, if you go to a Syrian camp and you see kids there, every single kid was born in that refugee camp. These are protracted crises. So you really have to think about these as issues that require a system-level understanding and a system-level solution as opposed to sort of solving the problem in just here and now. The other issue that is important is that you also have to pay attention to the local host communities. Those host communities typically are struggling to begin with. On top of that, they have an influx, and that creates all kinds of resentment. So our approach, and we hope that this is one that is ethically okay, is focused on looking at the system as a whole and not just sort of looking at the refugee problem in isolation. I want to come back to this issue of medicine quality. Typically, when people look at medicines and the quality that is facing marginalized communities or vulnerable communities, they fall into 4 categories. Either there is poor manufacturing, and this is again an issue that keeps happening over and over again. That's what you see on top left. You see lots of expired drugs. I took that picture in 2014. This was headed to the market. The thing had already expired about 6 months ago. Of course, there's intentional falsification, people taking advantage of the poor and the vulnerable. That's what you see in the bottom left. And of course, lack of regulation that really addresses sort of one of the core reasons that we have this challenge. Counterfeit and substandard medicines are a global problem. And of course, they tend to affect disproportionately people who are marginalized, who are vulnerable. About 10 to 30% of all medicines in the world are substandard or counterfeit. That means that if I were to stock this whole room with medicines, about a third of them wouldn't make the basic cut. Now, we know that's not true because the ones here would probably be okay, whereas in another region, that number might be 70%. And it's that region that we are talking about. Of course, it affects our investment in international programs. And oftentimes, it is said that these substandard and counterfeit medicines are the driver of antimicrobial resistance. One of the key things that we want to talk about here is that how do we know that? As a scientist, we want to investigate how is poor quality medicine driving antimicrobial resistance. For that, I want you to think about a disease historically considered disease of the poor, TB. Now, TB, again, disproportionately affects the poor communities in many parts of the world. And one of the standard treatments for TB is rifampicin, a drug that came out in early 1960s. Counterfeit and substandard rifampicin is not that uncommon, unfortunately. Of course, it affects clearly the clinical outcomes, and you see that also in low-income communities. But one of the things that rifampicin does is that it degrades into something similar called rifampicin quinone. Now, rifampicin quinone and rifampicin are very similar structurally. One of them is a good drug, the other one is just an impurity. And if you have good systems, your drug will only have rifampicin and no rifampicin quinone. But if people were cutting corners, they were taking advantage of loose laws, your drugs will have rifampicin quinone. So what we did was we did a series of experiments to really think about how does presence of any rifampicin quinone would lead to resistance. And what we saw was that, I want to sort of walk you through this slide, that gray is starting to grow resistance, as you can start to see that if you have just rifampicin, resistance grows rather slowly. If you have rifampicin quinone, resistance starts to grow much faster. What was even more problematic is that once you have that impurity, even good drugs wouldn't work. A whole family of drugs wouldn't work. So people who are exposed to these drugs are basically losing out, not because of any fault of theirs. We dug in a little further, and we were able to identify specific mutations that are there that would lead to resistance. This work became the basis of some new policies by the WHO, World Health Organization, as well as US Pharmacopoeia. Now, many of us haven't had a first-hand experience taking rifampicin, but we have had first-hand experience taking another drug, Cipro. So those of us who travel abroad, traveler's diarrhea is something that Cipro allows you to sort of protect against. Cipro is also used for other infections, and certainly it is an important drug. Unfortunately, it is also used in the animal and the livestock industry, rather abused in that case. I want you to sort of look at the countries in dark where Cipro sort of prescriptions are high. And if I zoom in, I find Pakistan, I find Turkey, I find Lebanon, I find other places. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a causation. What I'm saying is that large Cipro use is also in countries that have poor regulation and large refugee populations. Compare the data at the top of Massachusetts over the last 20 years, that the Cipro prescriptions have been more or less flat. Compare that on the right in Lebanon, at the bottom right in Pakistan. So you have this constant challenge that you are dealing with here. When we were doing some work in northern Uganda, in Jamani at the Uganda-South Sudan border, we came across a pharmacy. Now that was very unusual, and it shouldn't have been there because drugs were free in the camps. And there was a health clinic, but this pharmacy was doing booming business. And when we asked the person, she wasn't a qualified pharmacist, but we asked who was sort of person managing the store, and she said that people are worried that it will take them too long in the health clinics to get drugs. It's a lot easier to go down, and refugees don't have a lot of money, but whatever they have, they can get the drugs, and they can sort of get that drug very, very quickly. That place did not have any electricity. It was dusty. It was hot. It was humid. And the lady there who was managing the store had a whole bunch of drugs. And when we asked her how she diagnosed it, she said she looks at a person and decides whether that individual has malaria or not. If she does have malaria, they get the malaria tablet. Otherwise, they get a Cipro. So just think about sort of the impact. There was no sort of discussion of quality. In some of the cases, manufacturing dates were there. In others, they weren't. Some of our work, and this is the work of a postdoctoral fellow in the lab, Carly Cheng, has shown that exposure to poor quality Cipro not only generates resistance to Cipro, it generates resistance to a whole bunch of other drugs that have nothing to do with Cipro, completely different classes. So the way you want to read this plot is that as you go from left to right, as it decreases, that's a zone of inhibition, that as it decreases, that means the drug is less and less and less effective. The three drugs that you're looking have nothing to do with Cipro. So resistance was developed because of exposure to poor quality Cipro. When you added other drugs, they start to work less and less as well. As I mentioned earlier, we want to think about this in the context of systems. And the question we want to ask is that it's very good that we can identify specific mutations, we can identify some of the challenges, but can we do something about this as well? Can we detect medicine quality? And this is something that President Brown mentioned. So why is detecting medicines hard? Well, detecting medicines is hard for several reasons. The first reason is that it is not something politicians want to invest in. If you are a politician, it's a lot easier to say you start a new hospital, you pay money to start a new clinic in malaria. Well, to test medicines is kind of like meh, right? So that doesn't get you a lot of votes. That's one aspect, so it's not a priority. There are other reasons as well. It is often expensive. It is not really easy to do because you want to test the quality of medicines, not just the box itself. And you have to really develop evidence that there is a constant problem out there. The existing solutions fall into two categories. The World Health Organization recommends a solution on the left-hand side. It's two large suitcases, semi-quantitative, and they call it portable. They're 200 pounds. The ones on the right are very expensive and oftentimes non-specific. So out of that necessity that we need to come up with technologies that can detect the quality of medicines at all points in the supply chain came some of our work, which we call PharmaCheck. And it's driven by a single mission. And the mission is that improve access to good quality medicines at all points for all people. And that's very important for us. And one of the ethical issues, again, I'm talking about some of the ethical questions that we've had, is the fact that we want this to be a technology that improves the system. Imagine a person who has had to walk 5 or 6 miles and have gotten medicines that are already very hard for her or him. You don't want that person to be able to now have the responsibility to test the quality as well. You want the system to protect that individual and that family. But as researchers, we are interested in both generating evidence of how bad the medicine quality is. Is it bad in the rainy season? Is it bad in one market versus the other? And use that to generate evidence and policy. Again, anytime you work in refugee environments, you have to be careful that you don't sort of embrace a colonial or a new colonial attitude where you tell people what their problems are and you tell them how to fix them. You've got to work with them and really sort of co-develop solutions that empower the local communities to make the decisions that they see fit. The technology is aimed at developing solutions that are both accurate and affordable. In other words, you want to be able to do that in a way that is both quantitative and also can work at all points in the supply chain. From a technological perspective, the key thing is sort of a system that uses fluorescent tags that bind to the drug, in this case, sort of the guts of the drug or the active pharmaceutical ingredient. And the reaction and the fluorescent signal that comes out of that is proportional to what exactly is in the drug. So if it's just chalk or sawdust, well, there wouldn't be a signal. If it is something 20% API, it will give a signal that is proportional to that. At the bottom of that is the development of probes that would bind specifically to drugs. And this is where some of our partnership with both industry and academia come into play. These are specific probes that would bind to the active pharmaceutical ingredient. They can be streamlined. And the way it works actually is both surprising that it works and great that it works. So you start with a large library of molecules and you sort of continue to select them against a target that sort of allows you to sort of decrease the pool so that you, at the end, you just have small number of molecules that are going to bind to that target. So you start with a large library, you continue to sort of get rid of the library until you're left with the molecules that are going to bind. That's a hard process and requires both lab skills and computational modeling. These equations are not here because President Brown likes equations and numbers. There is a real reason for these. This is because it tells you that we have to sort of account for random events that might happen, and how do you design the probes and the target in that. So it's a combination of experiment as well as computational modeling that allows you to do that. And we're working with our industry partners as well as other labs to design these aptamers. The current system that we have designed is aimed at 3 things: affordably and quantitatively test things, a simplified user experience. We do not want the burden on these communities to have to bring in experts that may not be available there. And third, that it provides quantitative results, not just a yes or no. If you look into the guts of the device, there's an optical component there, there's an imaging module, and there's a battery pack that can certainly be replaced by other batteries which do not require grid power. Currently, we can test pretty much all antimalarials out there. And this is important because in many of these places, certainly in Uganda and other places, malaria continues to be a challenge in the refugee camps. We can also test the quality of Cipro. We can also test tetracycline, and you see sort of the peak only with the aptamer and nothing else. You know, malaria in Pakistan historically has not been a major issue, except once. And that was in 2003, when there was an outbreak of malaria, and it was in a refugee camp. In the northwest region, the places where I showed you. And sort of these red lines are mine, but what happened was that it was substandard antimalarials being given to these Afghan refugees that led to a spike in malaria. The monthly report looks something like this, that at the end of, towards the end of 2003, there was a major spike. And the reason was something that we wouldn't have expected. The drugs actually had the active ingredient. They just never released it. These drugs were not releasing the active ingredient they were supposed to have, a process that is called dissolution. So look at the two drugs, what was the expected amount that should have been released, and what was actually being released, 16% versus 16%. So our technology aims to address that issue as well, and be able to measure how a drug is released from the tablet. And that is important because the quality of the drug is not just what's in there, but whether it is released or not. And we can sort of look at that from a more sort of a computational and an experimental perspective as well. And using an ultrasonic system, we can really sort of look at different brands of the same drug, different strengths, and calculate and measure how the drug is released and whether it is what it's supposed to be or not. To date, our results have been very promising, and I want to show some of the results. And I want to sort of draw your attention to two things. One is Minilab, which is sort of the current field standard. We do significantly better than that because that remains qualitative. And we do quite well with HPLC as well, which is 150 times more expensive and requires a huge setup. But there's another thing that I want to sort of draw your attention to, and that is the fact that we can do both tablets and liquids. And liquids are important as injectables or as drugs for pediatric patients. One of the things that is important for us is to be able to train the local workforce. And over the last 5 and 6 years, we have been working with sort of local FDAs, the local regulators, because ultimately our goal is to strengthen the system. We want the problem solution to be sustainable. We want it to last. We want it to help those who are affected now, as well as those who might be affected in the future. We hope that this would allow us to create a new field standard, get more relevant results that are relevant for those communities, and of course, at a lower cost. At the same time, we're also interested in looking at the long-standing challenges in these communities and in these countries. Currently, there is almost no testing. And our goal is to be able to implement that at all points in the supply chain, to be able to generate the evidence that is needed to solve some of these problems. So far we have looked at the science of how antimicrobial resistance might develop because of poor quality. We've also looked at what we can do to address some of these challenges. But we haven't closed the loop. We want these medicines to get to the people who need them most. And for that, I want to draw your attention to the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime, and that is in Yemen. A place we don't often hear about, a place that is called a slow death because of the complete collapse of the infrastructure and ongoing war. We've partnered with UNICEF to be able to model where are the places that will allow us so that we can have drugs there ready for any eventuality. And if something happens to that place, what might be the nearest place after that? What would happen because of climate change and changing temperatures? What happens when the drugs degrade? And we can model that. And some of this work is being used by UNICEF to inform the local partners. You know, war and conflict has an intergenerational legacy, and one that is quite troubling, to say the least. In 2003, when US forces invaded Iraq, soon after that, the doctors there in the field camps and elsewhere in the region started noticing the presence of a superbug that wasn't responding to frontline therapies. The technical term is Acinetobacter baumannii. The common term, Iraqibacter. It was a bug that they didn't know how to handle. It was MDR, multi-drug resistant. US forces, as these veterans came back to Walter Reed and back to their families, were getting increasingly concerned. There were, of course, lots of media reports, congressional hearings. Eventually, they were able to handle it because of both the intellectual capital and the resources. Unfortunately, the countries where it all started are still struggling with it. This was a report in CNN, in Kabul, and essentially in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon as well. And there's an important scientific question there that is very, very troubling. Some of our work has shown, along with others, that, excuse me, that one of the drivers of resistance is the presence of metal. Metal that was not imported because of some shipment. Metal that came because of bullets and bunker buster bombs. And that's now endemic in the region. The most troubling thing for me is that it is affecting kids who weren't even born in 2003. So there are important questions to ask. How does metal, or the presence of these heavy metals, which are not endemic in the region, lead to resistance, and how do we address some of those questions? And we're part of a consortium with colleagues in Lebanon, in US, in France, and in Switzerland to really sort of look at some of these questions. I've always believed that university professors have a role not just in creating new knowledge, but also in disseminating them. Universities are places for great debates. They're places to engage, to discuss, to disagree. And I think it's important that some of these global issues also make it to our classrooms. I've always believed that in our global health work, that we also want to take people closer to the places where some of these challenges are going on. And it's driven by three fundamental principles. The first one is we want to expose our students to the grandest challenges of our time. Those could be in climate change, but they're also in refugee health, in urban poverty and access to healthcare, in issues associated with migration and forced displacement. We want to experience the challenge firsthand, at the forefront and in the classroom. There are new digital technologies available, but there are also opportunities to work in these places with peers in these communities and in these countries. And finally, I think it is very important that we engage beyond disciplinary boundaries. I think a recognition of what the resistance pattern, Acinetobacter baumannii, is without knowing what was happening in 2003 war would be an incomplete story, and one that wouldn't make a lot of sense. Where do these metals come from that are now causing resistance? So we have to really think about these kinds of issues that are central to our ability to solve the problems. And over the years, I've had the pleasure of working with colleagues in the field, and I'm learning from that. As we started working on these issues of refugee health, I had the tremendous pleasure and opportunity to work with Professor Carrie Preston, who is a professor of English and Gender Studies, as well as the director of Kalachan Honors College. And we came up with what I think is a strong and an unusual immersive learning program where we take our students, about a dozen or so, and work with university colleagues in Lebanon at American University of Beirut and in Kampala at Makerere University. The program is called Program in Humanitarian Engineering and Refugee Health. It is driven by three main principles. The first principle is that we want our students to learn from experts who are experts in the region, its history, its epidemiology of refugee camps, anthropology. We want our students to be able to learn from them in a classroom-like environment. We also want our students to learn from their peers. It is important that our students are able to understand how does somebody who has grown up in Lebanon and sees refugees on a daily basis, how does he or she view them? What are the solutions in his or her mind? And how do we design collectively towards this problem? In the first week when we take our students, it dispels many of our preconceived notions. It also helps those students to see how does somebody tell us that the problem is in Lebanon and not at the south of your own border. And finally, I think it's important that we keep ethics as a central tenet of anything that we do. How do we engage with refugees? How do we treat them? How do we ask them questions? How do we make sure that we treat them with the dignity that they deserve? That treat them with the same humanity that we expect for ourselves? That they are people, just like you and me, not specimens under a microscope. This work has helped us really reach some of the policymakers, and that has been an important aspect. So we've had a strong partnership with the Prime Minister of Uganda, and we are sort of very fortunate that we are really sort of getting the ears of people who are in the policymaking business. As these students come back, they continue with their work, and it has made a transformative impact on them. Certainly has made it on me as well, through projects, through classroom participation, through personal development, through starting exhibitions. But it has taken us to the next level as well. So Professor Preston and I have now started an initiative for forced displacement, modeled after other successful university initiatives, where we want to reach out to students and faculty across campus in as different departments as you can imagine, and think collectively, learn from each other, engage in scholarly activities and and extracurricular pursuits. And that has been transformative for me and for many other colleagues. We did not realize and appreciate how many of our faculty are engaged in these kinds of pursuits already. And this initiative is allowing us to benefit from them and take some of that knowledge and transfer it to the classroom. For me, it has helped me think about the next set of challenges that I, as a researcher, as a biomedical engineering faculty, want to address. And of course, the first one is that we don't want to use the tools that were developed generations ago and are now being refitted. We want to come up with newer solutions that are optimized both for discovery, analysis, and impact. Urban environments are increasingly where most of the refugees are. They're not in camps. Some of them are, many of them are not. How do we handle this issue? There are activities on campus here and beyond that look for that. And finally, the issue of global climate change is making a tremendous impact on refugees, both in driving them out of their homes and also in making it harder for them where they are. The classic case in point is Yemen, a country that was already water stressed, now sort of seeing conflict as well. In South Sudan and in Uganda, northern Uganda, the effects of climate change means that refugees who were given some land to cultivate can't cultivate anymore. Right? So the issue of conflict, climate, migration nexus. I want to end with this picture. I was in Adjumani in northern Uganda, and this was right outside a health center in a refugee camp. And I was very troubled. The barbed wire, the exclusion, who can come in, who cannot. And I thought of somebody who is a very famous person on this campus and has made a tremendous contribution. And his name is Elie Wiesel. And he said that the opposite of love is not hate, but it's indifference. And I thought for far too long, we have been indifferent. And I think it's time to change that. Thank you.
Professor Zaman will entertain some questions. There are microphones, so if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get you a mic. Wow. There's one.
Hi, Professor Zaman. That was a really amazing talk, and I'm very thankful for you today for doing this. My name is Bushra. I'm actually a student from Northeastern, and I also do research on tuberculosis, and so I have a very strong interest in infectious disease and global health. And I wanted to ask what your thoughts are about global infrastructure on the preparedness of a large-scale epidemic, and what type of systems that we need to be in place for a response on, I guess, the science and medical response, as well as the policy level.
Thank you so much. I think there are people here in this room, I can point to a few who are far better experts in infectious diseases than I am. However, I can tell you that at least in some of the conversations that I've had with sort of these large consortia that are planning or are anticipating a large sort of pandemic-like event, science and engineering has a central role to play. So one that comes to mind is development of large vaccines. There's a consortium called CEPI, which is based in Europe, but they are really thinking of sort of looking at new vaccines for things like MERS and Lassa fever and others as well. I think in the whole Ebola story, we saw both the glass half full as how quickly a vaccine can develop, and glass half empty of how long it took for people to be able to respond because the system collapsed in ways that really sort of was very troubling. So I think system strengthening is a key thing. Historically, system strengthening has not been part of science and engineering component, but I think it's an important one. And there was an article 2 days ago by one of the former WHO heads on how much we need to prepare and how woefully underprepared we are. I do have a little bit of issue with some of those things because they are high level and non-specific, but I think some of that has to translate into actual research and sort of actual funding opportunities for people to contribute, because I genuinely believe that there is an opportunity for people to contribute to some of those things.
There's a question here.
Hi, Professor Zaman, thank you so much. This was fascinating, and I think the delay in questions was really just giving us a chance to catch our breath after this incredible, especially point at the end here. It's very moving. I'm on the faculty at the law school, and I'm interested in how you see the role of lawyers in your story, and regulators, how they might be able to help, how they hinder things, and then also if there are people on campus who would be interested in connecting with you, how is that best done?
So the easiest part of your question is the last one. And you can send me an email anytime. I'd be delighted to meet up. I think the question about volunteerism or the aspect of war is a very important one. And we ask that question the very first day we sort of select our cohort of people. I think it's an important one. It also sort of is one that needs to be handled very delicately. There are plenty of reasons for doing this, and there are plenty of good reasons for not doing this as well. And how do you find that right balance, I think, is important. It's also important that we do this with three things: a sense of modesty in what we promise, a sense of cultural humility of where we are going, and a sense of fundamental human decency of treating others with the level of human decency that we expect and everybody deserves. And I think if you have some of those key components as a central mission, then what happens is that you would work with local partners in these communities that have built trust. So I did not talk extensively about trust, but that continues to be a fundamental tenet of how you work in these places and how you sort of really build trust. So voyeurism is, I think, in some ways sort of is thrusting your superiority of sorts on communities that are voiceless and are stateless. So I think some of that has to be done, but it has to be done on an ongoing basis. You can't just have one lecture and say white savior syndrome is bad and then sort of do the things that are sort of perpetuating that. I think this is a constant engagement that has to be done, and we hope that we are moving in the right direction, but I think we have to check ourselves regularly for that.
Good evening. Thank you a lot for this great lecture. My name is Lilia Malarchuk. I came here from Ukraine as U.S. State Department fellow. I have a legal background, and I want to ask you if you separated the data in your analysis regarding women needs, women health needs in comparison with all refugee needs and challenges that women face in those environments, and new technologies they need to address, we need to develop to address those challenges, whether they are different or not.
I think that's a great question. I think in general you have to look at groups within these marginalized and vulnerable groups. So in some cases, technology development might actually hurt because it may sort of empower one group versus the other. Somebody that is already vulnerable may become more vulnerable. That I think has to be incorporated. In many cases, technologies invariably help men more than women, would almost rarely be designed towards orphans, and that comes much later. So you really have to check yourself constantly for that. In our work, in some of the things that we have looked at historically, for example, looking at the quality of oxytocin or misoprostol and others, these are focused on women's health in general. But I think what we tend to do is sort of, once we define the question, we sort of look at it from the ethical lens to make sure that it really reaches everyone, but that those questions and those communities within these vulnerable communities, I think that's a great question, and one has to, particularly the technology development community has to pay attention to that, absolutely.
Hasnan here from Pakistan. You have mentioned that for these countries where you have been working, trust has been a big need and fear has been a big issue in those populations. And over the past few years, different global organizations have been interacting with those communities. But why has the process of creating a medium which introduces trust in the population and eliminates fear has taken so long? And what do you think are the important components of creating that medium so that we could introduce trust in the society and eliminate fear from that population?
That's a great question, and while I have many stories of distrust, I don't think I have any answers. This is something that I think somebody who is perhaps a sociologist can answer better. What I can tell you that trust takes a long time to build, and it takes a minute to really lose it. And oftentimes, approaches of international agencies or governments are such that it creates intergenerational mistrust. The case in Pakistan and polio is an example of that. There are many other places as well. So that's all I can say on that. I don't know how to build trust, except that I think, again, you have to work with a sense of humility, decency, and a sense of humanity there.
Hi, Dr. Zaman.
Oh.
So you talked a lot about kind of the challenges and importance of treating diseases and how you're kind of taking the approach to that. But could you also touch a bit on the importance and if the challenges are similar, for example, for preventative care and especially, spreading vaccines in those low resource and refugee environments? How does that compare to treatment and kind of where the benefits, advantages, disadvantages might lie?
That's a great question. I do not work in that area. However, I can tell you that this whole humanitarian aid notion has been problematic because it has been exclusively focused on disease treatment. And I think people are now pushing back on that and said, look, if you're going to live in a place for 72 years, you can't constantly just be treating disease. You really have to think about both prevention and both sort of look at an individual and his or her life in a much more holistic way. So I think vaccination is one of them, but I think there are aspects of mental health, trauma, and that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier, is that there are opportunities for important research questions there that I think, I hope that many of our colleagues on this campus and around the country and around the world will look at from a rich academic and rigorous lens.
You have just broached the topic that I was going to bring up, which is there are enormous mental health issues with refugees worldwide. And how can the technological community address or help some of these issues? Is that possible?
So I'll defer to some of our colleagues, and I hope some of the conversation in reception and beyond would touch on that. That's not my area, so I cannot comment on that, of whether technology has a role to play. My immediate reaction is it has a role to play, but it has to be integrated within a larger scheme of things that looks at people in a much more holistic manner. That's my sort of immediate response, that it is part of the puzzle, an important part, but certainly not the only part, and needs to be grounded in sort of the other programs. But I can't comment on how or which technologies are needed. Oh.
Thank you.
Oh.
I'm a student at in the BME department here, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on how students and other academic people can contribute to this crisis without, going abroad or without directly working on some of the technologies you've been developing.
Sure. So I think our goal is that through these kinds of initiatives, we'll have more opportunities in various classes that allow us to really get a sense. There's also a Boston Refugee Clinic in BMC that is there, and it gives us an opportunity to sort of contribute, certainly in a way that is ethically appropriate, and see how to do that. Historically, Boston has had many refugee communities from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Syria, from Uganda. And I think in our own neighborhood, there's an opportunity to learn and engage and do so with a sense of humility as well. So I think there's an opportunity, and the initiative that I talked about aims to really look at that. Opportunities for students to go, opportunities for students to work in the lab, to really think and reflect from a broader perspective, and also contribute to the community here.
To elaborate a little bit further on exactly that point, you implied at the beginning that we could think about a university-wide approach to this. Particularly, we've got lots of people who are interested in global health. You must have thought about what kind of organizational things you could do to get something like that off the ground.
Yeah, so right now, I think this has been a remarkable opportunity to learn from our students as well as many of our faculty. So there are sort of organic things that are happening where we can contribute to classes and sort of learning opportunities. People have research programs that fit in very well. We're also sort of approaching foundations to really build that and create those opportunities. And I think there are programs within NIH as well that can look at specific pieces of that. So Fogarty, for example, is one of them that allows us to sort of think about that. There was a call not too long ago on using ethical use of data in humanitarian crises. So there are new opportunities, but what is needed is sort of, I would say, a structure that allows us to benefit from each other and sort of complement each other's skills that allow us to make a competitive case both internally and externally. I have to add here that I've spoken to university leadership, I've spoken to several deans, and every single one of them has been very supportive, both in terms of committing resources as well as providing faculty who are already working in this to really contribute to this initiative. And that, I think, speaks a lot about where our heart is and where we see there's an opportunity to create next generation of ethical leaders.
Thank you for this lecture. There's obviously a role for pharma in all of this. What's your experience in how they're engaging, and how effective is the engagement with pharmaceutical companies in this?
So, Paul, that's an actually very, very good question. In some of these places, we haven't seen an active role of companies, except, I would say the only exception we have seen a little bit in Lebanon, because Jordan has a large pharmaceutical industry, generic pharmaceutical industry that is interested in that. The procurement practices for many of these camps are absolutely archaic and sort of mind-numbingly problematic. And that sometimes becomes actually a bottleneck. And that means that everything goes through a very centralized system. It comes from a good place. But that means that many of the companies that want to contribute actually are unable to do so because there are many barriers and sort of really walls, so to speak, there. But I think some of these things are happening for people who may themselves be interested in sort of pushing in that. I give an example. It's not a pharma company, but somebody who is interested in this is Chobani. So Chobani's CEO is somebody who was a refugee himself, and he has been sort of pushing for some of these questions of how do you increase nutrition, for example, in these places, right? So I think there are people who are themselves motivated because of personal or professional reasons and have been thinking about some of these issues. Pharma, less so, but I may be wrong. I think there may be things happening that I just do not know about.
one more question up here. Last question.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm Catherine Caldwell-Harris from Psychology. You mentioned the white savior problem, but didn't get a chance to elaborate on it. You said you were trying to check yourselves. Well, what are you doing?
So I think there is always this notion that somehow we have figured it out what somebody's problems are, and we've also figured out what their solutions are. And I think we have to be very careful about that in knowing that having sort of this know-it-all kind of an attitude, that by reading one paper you tell people, and we see this all the time, you go there and you say, well, your problem is actually infectious disease, and they're saying, no, it's actually depression. No, because I read it in Lancet that your problem is actually infectious disease. It must be infectious disease because Lancet is right and you are wrong. So I think those are the kinds of things that happen. Or the fact that people go in with a sense that they would show up in these camps the first day and they would think they're solving all problems, right? So again, those are the kinds of things that we really have to caution ourselves against and know what the reality is. And I think we have to be very, very careful. And this is why I think the role of universities is so important, to engage that debate. And this white savior problem is not just with universities. We see this aid agencies all the time. I was at a recent conference where somebody said that, the problem with refugees in Pakistan is that they don't wash their hands. And somebody said, well, there is no clean water. Right? So, I mean, this notion that I know your problem, you are sick because you are not washing your hands without knowing, and this was somebody from MSF, right? So universities are places that allow us to really have that debate and say, look, we need to really check that. We need to really be grounded in reality and sort of engage with this in a much more richer way. So that's why I think universities have a role to play here.
Let's thank Mohammed for a wonderful. There are two commemorative items we give to Mohammed, one that lasts and one that may not. One is a plaque of the poster that we used to advertise this. On the back is a check in an envelope. Thank you again.